Hello everyone, I wanted to make a quick video on how to bake artisan sourdough bread. It's just three simple ingredients: flour, water, and salt. So first and foremost, you're going to need a starter. And a starter is simply fermented flour and water. You can make your own starter by mixing a 1:1:1 ratio, which is, the first day it's going to be 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. You allow that to sit loosely covered for about 12 to 24 hours. You discard all but 50 grams of the starter, and then you feed that with 50 more grams of water and 50 more grams of flour. It takes about 7 days to mature a starter fully enough to bake with, or you can find a local bakery or somebody else that bakes sourdough and ask for 50 grams of their already matured starter. Once you have a mature starter, make sure to feed it 2 to 3 times prior to baking. It's usually just 1 to 2 days, but you're going to want to make sure you feed it 75 grams water and 75 grams flour, and then just 50 grams of starter, and then you're going to want to wait till that triples in size. But if you're just starting out trying to mature your very first starter, just feeding it a 1:1:1 ratio, 50 grams, 50 grams, 50 grams is every 12 to 24 hours is enough. Once it starts doubling or preferably tripling in size, it's ready to bake with. So as you can see here, I like to put a rubber band at the bottom of the starter just so I can track the activity. It's easy to tell when it doubles or triples in size. Then the next step, you're just going to want to auto-lease your dough. Now this step is also optional. I've found it's easier to mix starter and salt in afterwards by auto-leasing the dough. All it does is you just pour the water and the flour together and mix that in, and you just wait for the gluten structure to form in the dough. And then once the gluten structure forms, you can go ahead and mix in the rest of your starter and salt. So then you're just going to want to mix it all together. Usually it takes about 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to speed this video up here in a minute, but just go ahead and mix it until you have a pretty consistent texture in your dough. I pretty much find it easiest to take your hand and scrape the outside of the bowl, as you can see I'm doing here, and I'll also put my hand in the middle and just kind of swirl it around. Here's my mixing in fast motion. So here you can kind of see, the dough doesn't really have any gluten formed. It's kind of just chunks. It's like Play-Doh. There's no stretchiness to it or anything. So when you auto-lease the dough, it helps bring some stretchiness, some more gluten structure before putting in your starter. Now this is about 30 minutes later. You can see the gluten starting to form. Now this is just the flour and the water. There's no starter or no salt in this yet. But this is when I consider the dough done being auto-leased. Not quite a window pane effect or anything like that, but it's ready for the starter and the salt. So just a side note on the hydration percentages. The higher the hydration, the harder the dough is to handle. But the more airy the crumb is going to be when you cut it open. The lower the hydration, the easier the dough is going to be to handle, but you're going to get a tighter crumb. And that's basically all hydration percentages do. So from here on out, I usually use what's called a stretch and fold method, which, as you can see, I just pick up a corner, stretch the dough over itself. It's kind of hard to do when you're initially mixing the starter in with the auto-lease dough, which is why I like to auto-lease in the first place. So basically, you just want to keep folding it over on itself until it has a pretty consistent texture feeling all throughout the dough. And then go ahead, cover that, and leave it covered for about 1 hour. 1 hour later, come on back, and then you're going to do another set of stretch of folds. So you just want to pick up a corner and get some air underneath the dough, fold it over on itself, and you do this usually 4 to 6 times. And I'll typically do this for the first 3 hours of the bulk ferment. Usually every 45 minutes to an hour. I'll come back and do a set of 4 to 6 stretch and folds and flip it over and cover it and wait again. As far as bulk fermentation goes, which is going to be the first step after you mix all the ingredients, this process right here is called the bulk fermentation. As far as the bulk fermentation goes, you basically want that to go until the dough itself doubles or triples in size. Probably doubling in size would be the safest bet if you're a beginner, because you don't want to overproof your dough. And the temperature of the room has a significant impact on how long the bulk fermentation is going to take. During the summer months, I usually keep my house around 74 degrees, and the bulk fermentation usually takes about 2.5 to 3 hours. During the winter months, I keep my kitchen around 66 degrees, so the bulk fermentation will take anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. Which is why I didn't bother putting a time down for the bulk fermentation. I made a mistake of following recipes times, and you really honestly just have to feel the dough. You have to know how it performs at what temperatures, and it's a lot of trial and error, but you'll get the hang of it after doing 10, 20, 30 loaves. Alright, so after your bulk fermentation is complete, you can go ahead and lightly flour the surface of a counter, table, whatever you're using. And then just gently kind of put your fingers down through the side and just gently pull the dough away from the bowl and let it fall onto the surface. You want to be careful not to degas the dough. Basically all the air pockets that the yeast has produced, you want that to be in your crumb when you cut the bread open. So once you get your bulk fermented dough onto the table, just go ahead and split it in two. You can measure it if you like, but I just eyeball it normally. And then I'm just going to do very gentle stretch and fold, pulling the corners on top of the dough until it's nice and rounded off. And then once I'm pretty happy with the seam, I go ahead and pinch it together the best I can, and then I'll flip it over. Some people will actually let that sit and bench rest for another 15 minutes to a half an hour. I don't normally do that because I haven't noticed much of a difference in the shaping of my dough, but some people swear by it that you can you can build more surface tension on your dough that way. So from here, you're just going to want to try to tighten up the surface of the dough. So what I like to do is I put my pinky kind of under where the seam is, and I'll just pull the dough, and then I turn it a quarter turn, and then I'll pull it again, and I'll do that several times until the surface of the dough is nice and tight. But you can see how much more round the ball of dough is now after rolling it like that. And then I like to use rice flour. You can use regular flour, but rice flour doesn't have any gluten in it, so it doesn't stick to the dough. Regular flour will stick to the dough. You also don't necessarily need a banneton. You could also use just a bowl and a kitchen towel, lightly floured obviously. So after you've got the surface tension built up on both of your loaves, just go ahead and place them into your bowl. And then you're going to cover those and refrigerate them until you're ready to bake. I usually let them sit for 12 to 24 hours in the fridge. The longer you let it go, the more sour your dough will become in the final bake. But you want to also be careful not to overproof it. You can't leave it in your fridge for too long. Although I've heard people say that they've let it proof in their fridge for up to 3 days. So I've never let it go that long. The longest I've ever gone was 24 hours. But feel free to experiment with it. I also just use a regular grocery bag to cover it. Saran wrap doesn't really stick. It's just the easiest thing, I think, in my opinion. Just tie it off. It lets a little bit of air in. Then usually in the last hour before I bake the dough, I will take the plastic off. It kind of just lets it dry the surface out a little bit. It's easier to dump out onto the work surface, whether it be the parchment paper or a baking stone. Normally, sometimes your dough will stick to your banneton, so I usually use this spoon here. It's just a rice cooker spoon. And I'll ease it away from the edge that way. It seems to work pretty well, and it falls right out. And then the next step is to score your dough. I'm very bad at this, so don't judge me. But basically what scoring does is it lets your dough expand in the oven. You're cutting a place for the dough to expand. I'm trying to carve an ear in this one. You could pretty much cut your lines wherever you want. You can make an X or whatever you want to do. There's lots of scoring methods, but I was trying to make an ear here. And you could do little decorations, like I like to do a flower, like a fern leaf, which I will be showing you right now. And I usually go very light on the stem, and then I do about a 1/4 inch deep on the leaves. But for the stem, I'll just basically let the lamb or knife, razor, whatever you use, just let it rest and just lightly just drag it across to make a line rather than cutting it in a gouge. And if you're using a Dutch oven, I find it easier to cut the parchment paper. If you don't cut it, there's the slack on that touches the dough affects how it rises in the oven. Now if you're using a Dutch oven, you're going to want to cook it at 475 degrees for the first 25 minutes, and then take the lid off and bake it uncovered for an additional 20 minutes or until you have your desired colored. If you're using a baking stone or just cooking it uncovered in general, typically I like to leave it at 450. It normally takes around 45 minutes or so, but you just have to watch until you have the right color. You'll get the hang of it, and if you burn a loaf, you'll just know to take it out a little earlier next time. So a Dutch oven is my personal favorite way to cook the bread. It essentially just captures the steam in the lid, and steam helps your bread rise in the oven. You could also just use a baking stone and just put a pan of water or something in the oven, and that'll get you plenty of steam as well. And that's it. Give it a shot and let me know how your loaf turned out.